the Catholic Men's Podcast, helping you find good works of literature for the Catholic gentleman. The Great Plague of Marseilles, 1720. A Lesson in Faith and Confidence in the Sacred Heart of Jesus, by Gustavo Solomeo. "300 years ago, on May 25, 1720, the ship Le Grand Saint-Antoine docked in Marseille coming from Syria. Due to negligence, laxity, and corruption, the port and municipal authorities allowed an illegal passenger to disembark, the Bacillus Plague. What followed passed into history under the name the Great Plague of Marseille. 1720. The plague devastates Marseille, a rich but vulnerable city. For 2 long years, the scourge punished the city, and then the region. At the height of the epidemic, from August 20th to September 15th, 1720, 1,000 people a day died in Marseille. According to the highest estimates, the plague decimated about half of the population of Marseille, that is, about 50,000 people, including the rural area around the city, and all of Provence, then populated by about 400,000 souls. There were between 90,000 and 120,000 deaths in the same period, that is, 1/3 of the population. On the eve of the epidemic, Marseille was the 2nd or 3rd city in the Kingdom of France by the number of inhabitants. It was governed by 4 échevins, municipal magistrates, chosen by representatives of the city's bourgeoisie and renewed in pairs every 2 years. Despite the difficult economic situation of the kingdom, the city was very prosperous. One of the largest ports on the Mediterranean, the first in France, it enjoyed a quasi-monopoly on maritime trade with the Ottoman Empire, and particularly with the Levant, Near East, and the Barbarian coast, North Africa. In the 18th century, between 200 and 400 ships from that region arrived in Marseille annually. In 1714, the value of the Levant products brought to the port of Marseille totaled 23 million, an amount never before reached. However, this very situation as a port city and the intense traffic with the great Mediterranean ports made it more vulnerable to pandemics from the east. Nonetheless, at the beginning of the 18th century, the plague had not reached Marseille for nearly 70 years, thanks to an operational health system based on quarantine and lazarettos that prevented epidemics. If all security protocols were observed, the port and the city would be relatively secure. That long period of immunity contributed to a lack of vigilance regarding a risk that is always latent. Another bacillus, the Jansenist heresy. As is often the case, alongside a great surge of prosperity, a spirit of moral laxity had invaded the city, and debauchery common to port areas overflowed to other parts of the city. At the same time, another bacillus, more lethal than the plagues, Jansenism, had infected sectors of the clergy, and especially the Oratorians, who ran an important school. Some of their students were contaminated, as well as some convents and communities of women religious. Jansenism was an infiltration of the theological and moral errors of Calvinism. It gave rise to a sectarian current characterized by moral and disciplinary rigorism, meticulous legalism, and many scruples. Among other things, they denied papal primacy and pontifical infallibility. They claimed that Christ did not die for all men, but only for the predestined, that the sacraments were not to be received often, but only after a long and severe preparation. Unfortunately, a large number of people under its influence practically stopped receiving our Lord. The Church very often condemned these errors. The warnings of God and men fell on deaf ears. The plague did not come suddenly or unexpectedly, like lightning in a clear blue sky. There had been no lack of warnings from men or from God. As early as 1718, the great admiral of France, Louis-Alexandre de Bourbon, had warned Sieur le Bret, intendant governor of Provence, that the plague was hovering around Marseilles and had prescribed severe measures to stop it through a very precise quarantine and imposed on all ships coming from countries infected by the contagion. Merchants from the Levant, such as the famous Chevalier Rose, also alerted the Marseille authorities that the plague was raging in that region. That same year, 1718, during the 40 hours adoration before Lent, our Lord showed himself visibly in the Blessed Sacrament displayed in the Church of the Friars Minor of Observance, Cordeliers, in front of the crowd gathered for worship. Quote, "His face was so dazzling with majesty, his gaze both so tender and so severe that no one could bear the sight of it. The faithful assembled in the church were terrified." End quote. Not far from there, in the Visitation Monastery, Sister Anne Madeleine Remusat, continuing the mission of Saint Margaret Mary Alacoque, received at the same time the supernatural communication that heaven was angry with Marseille, and that this Eucharistic prodigy was meant to have the city convert. If it did not, it would be struck in such a terrible way that the universe would be astonished. Sister Anne Madeleine entrusted the divine message to Father Millet, her spiritual director, who in turn transmitted it to the bishop, Most Reverend Henry de Belsunce. Optimism, carelessness, and self-interest. Unfortunately, the warnings from the high maritime authorities and merchants found little echo in the local government and among the population. Out of optimism, carelessness, or self-interest, these authorities neglected the most basic safety standards to prevent the epidemic from spreading, and the carefree and frivolous city remained indifferent to the warnings of men, just as it would continue insensitive to God's warnings. Despite the redoubled efforts of its zealous bishop, Marseille, once an example of religiosity, did not turn its back on immorality, nor did its clergy give up Jansenism. Everything continued as before, until it's the plague. On May 25, 1720, Le Grand Saint-Antoine docked in Marseille. It came from the Levant, present-day Syria, where the plague was rampant. Her cargo was so infected that the crew fell ill. 9 sailors died on board during the voyage, but the ship was not subjected to the strict confinement measures provided for in health regulations. That is because the ship owners, who are also échevins, municipal magistrates, feared that their precious cargo of Eastern fabrics would be damaged or lost if they were exposed to the sun and wind for 40 days on an island in the port. For their part, the port doctors decided on a mild quarantine. After 15 days, the sailors disembarked and were locked in a lazzaretto, quarantine hospital. But once on land, the men did not bother to secure their dirty clothes, probably infested with fleas, the vector of the plague bacillus. They made bundles of them and threw them over the enclosure to the washerwomen. As for their precious cargo, it was landed and placed in a warehouse to which many people had access. That exposed them to contact with the bales of tissue, which were undoubtedly infected with the fleas that transmit the fatal bacillus. On June 20th, a washerwoman died after a few days of agony without anyone noticing the telltale boil on her lips. It was only on July 9th, after some other deaths, that 2 doctors called to a teenager's bedside finally sounded the alarm. It's the plague. However, the échevins did not take any severe measures for the pretext not to cause panic in the population. Until the beginning of July, these magistrates denied that the plague had infected people. They spoke of a malignant fever and still hoped that contagion would be limited. Only at the end of the month did they effectively take action against the epidemic. But it was too late. Evil had already enveloped the city, sweeping through all its districts, threatening neighboring provinces and the entire kingdom. The scourge plagued the region for long months. At the height of the epidemic, from August 20th to September 15th, 1,000 people a day died in Marseilles. The measures taken were not very effective. The plague epidemic progressed in the old city. Contagion first hit the poorest neighborhoods, where the sick and dead quickly multiplied. Infirmary wards could no longer receive the sick. The hospitals, very old and dilapidated, were utterly insufficient. On July 15th, the bishop ordered all his priests to say at Mass the prayer to Saint Roch, the great protector of Christians against all contagion, and recommend that they exhort the faithful to do penance to atone for their sins. A horror show. The symptoms of the disease were frightening. The unfortunate people would be burning with fever, covered with pustules, writhing with pain. They died in a few days, sometimes in a few hours. With the July heat, the city turned into a hell. The water was so scarce that the municipal councilors decreed rationing and threatening with the death penalty anyone who diverted water from the aqueduct for their own use. At first, the dead were buried in quicklime, and their houses were walled. As the epidemic advanced, corpses were thrown onto the streets for lack of undertakers. Those struck with the plague were left alone in their homes, with at most a piece of bread and a jug of water. The poorest had nowhere to turn for help. Many employed the rest of their strength to drag themselves to the sanatorium, but often were unable to get there and would fall and die in the streets. This description of the Provençal historiographer Jean-Pierre Papin, published in 1809, is impressive. Quote, "This spectacle was particularly frightening in Dauphin Street, which is 360 yards long by 10 yards wide. There the bodies of the sick and dead were piled up to such a point that one could not take a step without stepping on them. The reason for this pile-up is that the street ended up at the Hospital of Convalescents." End quote. As the situation went out of control, the bodies of the sick and dead invaded the streets. Whichever way you look, you see the streets all littered on both sides with piles of corpses, almost all rotten, hideous, and appalling to see, narrates Nicolas Picotti de Croissant, orator of the city council and the king's attorney in the police. By the end of August, the bishop, Most Reverend Henri de Belsunce, draws the following picture in a letter to the Bishop of Toulon. Quote, "By the grace of God, I am still standing among the dead and dying. Everything around me was brought down, and of all the ministers of the Lord who have accompanied me, I have only one chaplain left. From my house, which has become a hospital for plague victims, 11 corpses came out, and I still have 5 people sick but out of danger. The plague has been in Marseilles for 3 months, and does not end. Alas, what have I not seen and felt, with 200 dead bodies rotting around my house and under my windows for 8 days. I was forced to walk the streets, all without exception, lined on both sides with half-rotten, dog-gnawed corpses, and the center strewed with throngs of plague victims and rubbish, so you did not know where to step. I had a sponge soaked in vinegar under my nose, my cassock rolled up under my arm, and had to cross vile corpses to find the dying thrown out of their houses and placed among the dead on mattresses to hear their confession and console them. Rotting heaps of slain dogs and cats increased the horror of the spectacle and the unbearable stench." End quote. Run for your life. On July 31st, the Parliament of Aix, capital of the province, established a sanitary cordon around Marseilles and its territory, isolating the unfortunate city from the rest of Provence and depriving it of the necessary resources to feed itself. That severe measure was considered necessary to prevent the departure of 2,000 to 3,000 hungry vagabonds, whom the magistrates wanted to expel from the city, and whose departure could cause the plague to circulate throughout the kingdom. And so it was done. Marseilles, the pestilent city, was left to its own devices. To the disease were added hunger, unemployment, misery, robbery, and looting. People were reduced to begging to be able to stock up grain and other essential foods. A deadly silence hung over the streets, and public places crowded with dead bodies. The disease affected all types of people, regardless of their rank. At that point, fear took over people's minds, and everyone figured they had better flee for safety, beginning with most civil servants, unfaithful to their duty. The wealthy people left Marseilles to take refuge in their villas in the countryside, as did authorities, civil servants, and many priests, such as the canons of the Saint-Martin Church, who took refuge in the fields. No more courageous was the attitude of the monks of the famous St. Victor Abbey. The monks closed themselves behind the walls of their monastery. They carefully sealed all the openings and contented themselves with sending some alms and announcing they were praying for everyone's salvation. In contrast, the attitude of the Bishop Henri de Belsunce was that of the Good Shepherd who gives his life for his sheep. He refused to run for his safety, as religious and civil authorities did during the preceding plagues, as they suggested to him, quote, "As for me, I intend to dwell with the plague-stricken, to console them, to die, if necessary, of pestilence and hunger." End quote. He not only stayed in the city, but was not confined to his episcopal palace, except for a few days in September, when the stench of corpses accumulated in the streets and squares became unbearable. He dedicated himself to his sheep on the city streets without fear of being exposed to contact with the sick. Some priests who had relented in a moment of panic, exhorted by their bishop and encouraged by his example, returned to their posts and heroically devoted themselves to give spiritual assistance to the destitute faithful. The price to pay was high. The vast majority of the secular clergy perished, 43 Capuchins, 26 Recollects, and 18 Jesuits, including Father Millet, confessor to Sister Anne-Madeleine Remusat. Soon there was only a handful of brave priests around the bishop to assist the sick and give the last sacraments. In his speech to the clergy assembly in 1725, Bishop de Belsunce declared that more than 250 priests and religious had perished in their mission of Christian charity. The churches remained open until the end of August. On August 24th, Bishop de Belsunce was forced to close the places of worship as corpses piled up at the church doors, and the magistrates would like to systematically dump them into the church basements, where many had been buried at the beginning of the epidemic. The bishop objected to it because he feared that the stench would infect the temples in such a way as to render them unusable for celebrations. Faced with the closing of churches, some priests continued to preach outdoors. Bishop de Belsunce organized all processions and collective prayers, but the municipality ended up banning them on the allegation of preventing the spread of contagion. Quote, "I have just issued a reminder to order prayers and fasts, as the city councilman asked me to not make a procession in imitation of St. Charles Borromeo. The terror is great, however, I trust in the mercy of God." End quote. Henri de Belsunce was also concerned with the eternal destiny of the souls of the victims of the plague, in particular those who died without the sacraments and were buried in profane soil. He received from Pope Clement XI 2 briefs granting a plenary indulgence to the faithful who died during the contagion when the priests celebrated for them the Mass of the Dead. On October 9th, the bishop issued a communiqué to the secular and regular priests of his diocese about these treasures of the Church, and summoned them to free from purgatory the many thousands of souls for whom no one thinks of saying a prayer. The Pope did not stop there. He sent 2,000 loads of wheat from his pontifical states to help the people of Marseilles. The safeguard of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, a powerful and spiritual shield. Faced with the damage caused by the plague and the absolute lack of human resources to stop the scourge, Sister Anne-Madeleine turned to heaven. She received the inspiration that they should have recourse to the heart of Jesus as the only one capable of helping them effectively. Thus, under the impulse of Anne-Madeleine Remusat, they distributed thousands of small images of the Sacred Heart, known as safeguards. They were small pieces of red cloth on which the Divine Heart was printed in black on a piece of white cloth sewn on top of the red fabric. It had the inscription, "Heart of Jesus, an abyss of love and mercy, I place all my trust in thee, and hope for everything from thy goodness." This call for confidence in divine mercy was a message directly opposed to the Jansenist doctrines that infested the region, the proud rigorism of which rejected any reference to commiseration, piety, or forgiveness. The name safeguard, given to these small images widely distributed at the initiative of the pious visitation nun, was soon justified. This powerful spiritual shield protected thousands of people by preserving from contagion or by healing after they were affected by the plague. Examples of heroic courage: the Knight Nicholas Rose. Among those thus miraculously cured was the celebrated Knight Nicholas Rose, a man of faith and courage who is still revered as a hero by his fellow citizens today. When the plague epidemic of 1720 broke out, Rose immediately offered magistrates his services to defeat the evil. Due to his experience, he was appointed General Commissioner of the district of Rive-Neuve. He closed the sector for which he was responsible, establishing checkpoints, erected a gallows to stop looters, dug large pits to bury the corpses, converted the facilities of a rope factory into a hospital to house patients and distribute aid. He also organized the city supply. On September 16, 1720, Rose led a company of about 150 soldiers and convicts, the Crows, equipped with tipping carts, tongs, and rakes, to remove more than 1,200 corpses piled up on the Esplanade de la Tourette, a poor neighborhood by the port. The bodies of the most recently deceased had laid unburied for 3 weeks. In half an hour they were thrown into the pits and covered with lime and soil. It was an essential but extremely dangerous task. Only 12 of the convicts were still alive 5 days later. Renewing his strength, the knight tirelessly pursued his task until he was hit by the plague. Because of the minimal chances of survival for lack of modern treatments, his life was saved by a miracle. Military intervention. Given the city's difficulties, on September 4, 1720, the court decided to appoint a military man endowed with extraordinary powers to lead the city and its territory. The one chosen was the knight Charles-Claude Andral de Langeron, commander of the Order of Malta and fleet master in the royal galleys. Langeron canceled social events of all kinds, closed or regulated markets, taverns, inns, and houses of ill repute in infected areas. He was basically in charge of enforcing martial law with absolute power in matters related to policing and city administration. An audacious act, consecrating the diocese to the Sacred Heart. The epidemic was seen as a punishment from God, and Bishop de Belsunce deemed it so primarily because of the actions of the Jansenists in his diocese. Several ceremonies were organized to appease divine wrath, processions around the city, masses under the porches of closed churches, etc. However, after 5 months, the plague continued to devastate the city. What else to do? In her convent, Sister Anne-Madeleine continued to offer prayers and sacrifices, but realized that something was missing and communicated it to her superior. To show his mercy, God wanted the Sacred Heart of his Son to be honored. Quote, "Having been ordered by my superior to ask God to let me know by what means he wants us to honor the Sacred Heart to obtain the cessation of the plague that afflicts this city, he let me know after communion that he was asking for a solemn feast to honor his Sacred Heart, that through prayer to the Sacred Heart the people of Marseilles would be delivered from contagion, and that finally all those who adopt this devotion would only lack help when this Sacred Heart lacked power." End quote. Bishop de Belsunce responded to this message with 2 initiatives. On October 22, 1720, he instituted the Feast of the Sacred Heart in his diocese. The following November 1st, during a public ceremony, he consecrated the city and diocese to the Sacred Heart, which once again constituted a severe blow to the cold and cruel rigor of Jansenism. At that feast of All Saints, the bishop crossed Marseilles barefoot, without a mitre and with a rope around his neck, as St. Charles Borromeo had done, to show that he took on all the sins of the city. On the esplanade that bears his name today, he celebrated Mass in front of a moved crowd and placed the diocese under the protection of the Sacred Heart. The Mistral, terrible southern wind that blew in the morning over the city, paused only long enough for this ceremony. Bishop de Belsunce saw that as a sign of divine blessing. Immediately, the plague diminished until it disappeared completely. The Diocese of Marseilles celebrated the Feast of the Sacred Heart for the first time. The Sacred Heart of Jesus wants to be honored publicly and officially. However, heaven was not entirely satisfied. On the one hand, there was no sincere conversion, and great licentiousness followed the end of the plague, as often happens after periods of stress. On the other hand, the magistrates, some of whom were imbued with enlightenment, skepticism, or corrupted by Jansenism, had failed to participate in the public consecration to the Sacred Heart of Jesus. In early May 1722, the epidemic reignited. Once again, the plague devastated the city and extended to the surrounding fields. It would withdraw definitively only when the magistrates, as representatives of the public authority, set an example by officially involving the city in this devotion to the Sacred Heart. Bishop Henri de Belsunce perfectly understood the message and wrote to Marseilles' Échevin, "I do not want to offer you anything that could cause some expense to the city, unfortunately too badly tried. God does not ask for our gifts, but for our hearts. Therefore, in the name of the city, make a vow capable of disarming the avenging arm which seems to rise again against us." The municipal magistrates heard his appeal, and by the decision of May 28, 1722, hastened to promise, "We, Échevins of the city of Marseilles, have unanimously agreed that we will make a firm, stable, and irrevocable vow in the hands of the Lord Bishop, by which, in said capacity, we commit ourselves and our successors in perpetuity to go every year on the day which he has affixed the feast of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, to attend Holy Mass in the church of the first monastery of the Visitation, known as La Grande Marie, to receive communion, and, in reparation for the crimes committed in this city, offer a candle or torch of white wax, weighing 4 pounds, adorned with the coat of arms of the city, to burn this day before the Blessed Sacrament, to attend the same evening a general procession of thanksgiving, that we pray and ask the bishop to deign to establish in perpetuity." Magistrates Moustier, Daudet, and Pierre Humuzat, Anne Madeleine's uncle, pronounced the vow on June 4th and fulfilled it for the first time on June 12th, on the Feast of the Sacred Heart. From that day on, the number of sick people decreased wonderfully. Faced with this situation, public prayers were doubled, and at the end of a novena ordained by the great bishop, defeated by that supernatural counteroffensive, the plague ended entirely. Lessons for our days. In the present coronavirus epidemic, the Great Plague of Marseilles of 1720 came to the mind of not a few. What lessons can we draw from this event on its third centenary? First of all, the Plague of Marseilles in 1720 contains a lesson of faith and trust in the Sacred Heart of Jesus. It was thanks to the spread of safeguards, shields of the Sacred Heart, that many found relief and cure of the plague. And it was by the consecration of the city and the diocese, with the participation of the civil authorities to the Divine Heart, that the plague receded until it completely disappeared. Even today, after 3 centuries, the Mediterranean metropolis still celebrates its salvation through this devotion. Quote, "This year, during the period of confinement caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, the Archbishop of Marseille, Monsignor Jean-Marc Aveline, anticipated the tercentenary of the consecration of the diocese to the Sacred Heart and solemnly renewed it on Palm Sunday on the porch of the church Notre-Dame de la Garde. Well, I hope you are encouraged by listening to that article, and I just want all my listeners to know that you're in my prayers every day, and never stop having calm, courage, and confidence. Thanks for listening, and Godspeed.